Hey folks, that's the wrong camera. How's it going? I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is a ThieAudio Monarch Mark II. So this is another ThieAudio Tribrid IM that came out last year, and this is kind of their flagship IM. The Monarch Mark II is two ESTs, how many fingers is that? 6 balanced armatures, 1 dynamic driver, coming in at a cool $1,000. And you might be surprised to hear that I bought this thing for myself, and that might be doubly surprising if you recall my review of the original Monarch, because I didn't love the original Monarch. I thought, frankly, it was too bassy. But I did end up buying the Monarch Mark II, and the reason why is actually on the strength of a listening demo that I had with my buddy Precog Vision late last year, where he brought by a Monarch Mark II. I listened to it, and to be honest, I've heard a lot of pretty expensive IMs, especially through Precog. And I don't know, I keep coming back to my Moondrop Blessing 2, which is not an especially expensive IM, and I don't know, I keep hearing these more flagship IMs and thinking I still prefer the Blessing 2, but the Monarch Mark II was the first IM that I heard, where I thought maybe this might be the replacement for the Blessing 2, because it's got a nice tonality. It's got, of course, excellent technicalities, and the bass is finally brought within range of reasonable, at least for my taste. So I went ahead and bought one, and for the past summer or so, I've been spending a lot of time listening to the Monarch Mark II, comparing it to some of the best IMs that have come out this year, but also just some of my favorite IMs that I've got, and finally ready to do the review, so that's what we're going to do today. Like all on my other reviews, this is a live stream, hence you saw the wrong camera angle earlier. But if you've got any questions, the upside of that is if you have any questions that you want me to answer about the Monarch Mark II, feel free to drop it in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have some back and forth conversation, and hopefully I can answer all of your questions. But for now, let's dive to the table and start talking about, first of all, the build quality, then we'll talk about the sound, and then we'll talk about the comparisons, how this thing compares head to head with a number of other IMs. So, all right, the physical stuff first. We'll talk about the packaging, what comes inside the box. Here is the box. It is quite hefty, as you might imagine, for a quite hefty IM. And what it comes with is a nice ThieAudio case. I think this is just about the same case that comes with the ThieAudio Legacy 4, which is a much cheaper IM, but it's honestly a pretty nice little case anyway. It also came with a plethora of tips, but to be honest, I actually bought this secondhand, so I tossed out all the tips. But it does come with a leather-ish cable tie, and then what you might see here are these swappable terminations. So this will lead us into talking about the cable that this comes with, and it does, like a lot of other IMs, come with a cable that's got swappable terminations down here, right? So you can go from a 3.5 millimeter cable to pop that off, twist that on. Now I've got a 4.4 millimeter balance cable. So I know a lot of people like these things. I personally, I pretty much just use 3.5 millimeter if I have the choice. So given I have the choice, that was what I use. But for people that, you know, want to use balance, it's nice to have that option for sure. That said, well, let's start getting into the nitty gritty of this cable. First of all, this termination swappable mechanism, it's definitely on the chonky side, and maybe it's not totally obvious sitting here in my hand, but let me pull in the termination of the cable that I ended up actually using in most of my real life. Now, maybe this isn't fair because that's a 4.4. I'm gonna put the 3.5 back on here, so you can kind of just see apples to apples. I am struggling. There we go. Apples to apples, how big and chonky this termination is. It's big. It's hefty. It's kind of club-like. And to be honest, I actually accidentally broke one of my DAPs because this thing was so chonky. It was just in my back pocket, and I happened to lean forward, and there was enough torque on it from this very large termination that it actually broke the 3.5 millimeter connector on my DAP, which I'm not going to hold that too much against this because I already thought that it was too big, to be honest. Okay, the rest of the cable we'll talk about. It does have a nice behavior to it. Let me move this. I forgot to call out the nice ThieAudio microfiber, but we'll move it out of the way for now. The rest of the cable, it does actually have a pretty nice behavior on it. It is cloth covered, if you can tell. And some cloth covered cables just don't have very good behavior. Some of them have really good behavior. I would say this is definitely one that has very good behavior, but I will still quibble that it's like the termination, it's just kind of chonky, especially when you get up here into the preformed ear hooks. You can see that, I don't know, aesthetically, I feel like they are pretty overbearing. They're just, everything about this earphone is pretty big, and that cable definitely contributes to that sense. So that was part of why, personally, you know, as handsome as this cable is, and in fact, it looks quite good, especially on the Monarch Mark II, I ended up just using kind of like a cheap, more basic, lightweight cable because I found that it was, the size of this thing just became a little bit detrimental to the use. But that's kind of a precursor to what we're going to talk about next, which is going to be the earpieces themselves. So aesthetically, we'll start with the aesthetic stuff. I think this is actually a pretty good looking earphone. I think it's definitely an improvement over the original Monarch. It's got kind of like this lava looking aesthetic to it. It's got some dimension to it. The shells aren't entirely solid, so you're not going to peer into them and see the drivers or anything, but I don't know. It's certainly a nice build and a decent aesthetic. Of course, ThieAudio, they tend to put their logo on there fairly large, but because of the pattern there, it is, I think, I don't know, it's not quite as ostentatious as you might worry. Now, the aesthetic out of the way, and the build quality is good. They're a little bit on the lightweight side, but certainly don't have any quibbles there or qualms there. Aesthetic out of the way, let's talk about how these things fit, because I gotta be honest, this is gonna be a big warning about the Monarch Mark II. I bought these from somebody, I bought them secondhand from somebody who was selling them because for him they were too large. And I made that purchase and continued kind of like just watching the used market, and was maybe not entirely surprised to see a lot of Monarch Mark IIs for sale. And most of the time people are saying, there's nothing wrong with it, it just doesn't really fit my ear. And I think that's gonna be the experience, frankly, for a lot of people, including myself. So you might recall I had that issue with the original Monarch, and I can kind of start to show you how this thing fits in my ear. It is definitely chonky. You see the scrunching up here of my skin? That is because this thing, see, it's not doing no scrunching. Put this thing in my ear, a little bit of scrunching. This thing is chonky AF. And a lot of that chonk comes from basically two main areas. So there is this volume here toward the front of my ear canal, where it is quite large. I guess we can go to the table and talk about this thing, right? So there is this area right here is quite large. And then as well, the area that sits inside of the concha is also quite large. Now, to be honest, I actually struggled quite a bit with fit on this IM, to the point that it actually was affecting the sound. So basically what I was getting was, you know, I could manage to stuff it into my ear, and I thought maybe I would get used to that. But the downside of me stuffing it into my ear is that while it was creating kind of like a seal up here, sort of like the outer part of my ear canal, it wouldn't create a seal very consistently at the inner part of my ear canal. And the effect of that was that there was basically just no bass half the time I fitted this thing. Now, what I have done, what has basically solved that problem for me, is I fitted these ASLA EarFit Light tips. And like I've said on other reviews, these ear tips happen to have the effect of actually lengthening the nozzle a little bit, which you might think would be the opposite of what I need. In fact, it took me a while to arrive at these ear tips because I didn't think I needed the nozzles to be longer. I figured I needed everything to be a little bit smaller. But what that longer nozzle has allowed it to do is get into my ear canal, create a nice, easy seal, and I don't know, it basically pushes out the entire body of the IM. I don't know if you can take a look at that. Like, it is not fitting entirely inside my concha. So fair warning with this IM, even if, wrong camera again, fair warning with this IM, even if it is exactly what you want in terms of sound characteristics, it's worth trying it out. It's worth demoing it before you commit yourself to a $1,000 purchase, because there's a very good chance that it might just not fit your ear. Like, I would say it barely fits my ear. I've gotten it to the point where I can fit it fairly easily. I can say the ingress egress is fairly easy, like it's not so fiddly, but it still definitely feels large in my ear. I would say comfort is not ideal because of that. And because it's kind of hanging out of my ear, fit security is also not entirely ideal. So there's your fair warning. And you know, the thumbnail of this video alludes to two big issues, and that is a pun, by the way. That is definitely the first too big issue. It's too big. But there you go. Okay, so that's the physical stuff out of the way. Let's now start talking about the sound quality. And like I mentioned, we're going to talk about the sound signature, the technicalities, what I like, what I don't like. And then we're going to get into comparisons head to head with some other IMs that you might be interested in cross-shopping the Monarch Mark II against. So for starters, let's just talk about the sound signature here on this earphone. And the sound signature, as you might guess, because I liked it quite a bit, is a mid-range focused sound signature. This is basically a neutral sound signature with a bit of sub-bass boost, which is kind of what I thought the original Monarch was, but to my ear, the original Monarch just was like really overbearing bass. Like the original Monarch, the bass here is definitely in the sub-bass focus, right? But I think it's a lot more balanced, frankly. In fact, I would say a lot of the times this set doesn't even really come across as a very bassy earphone at all, which is interesting. Now the mid-range, I mentioned that this is kind of a mid-range focused tune. It is a smidge on the forward side. I would say it's definitely, I would not say that this is, you know, in danger of being called shouty by anybody, but it is a little bit more forward in that vocal range. And that's a thing that, I don't know, frankly, I appreciate. That's part of why I liked it. Now, what I will also say about the tonality is that it's a little bit lean. And that's going to happen in sort of like the lower mid-range and upper bass region, where this has kind of got like that Harmon dip going on with it, which is a thing that I've talked about before, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. One of the effects that it has is it just kind of leans out the mid-range. It makes it so that that meaty sub-bass you get there doesn't at all bleed into the mid-range, but it does also have a kind of an effect of making a little bit on the clinical sound. But overall, really it is just kind of like a transparent, somewhat clinical, neutral sound signature with a little bit of party bass from time to time, depending on what music you're listening to. So that's the overall sound signature. What do I like here about the sound on the Monarch Mark II? Well, given the fact that I bought it for myself after demoing it, there's definitely a lot here that I like, and the tonality that I just described, I would say is nearly perfect. Especially look at that on squig.link. I've got that linked in the description down below. And again, I am not in the business of reviewing frequency responses, but it is pretty indicative of how close this thing is to hitting my frequency response target. It's really, really good. So again, the mid-range focus, you got a little hint of vocal forwardness. You got, I think, excellent treble balance where it's neither dark nor bright. You get a little bit of sub-bass emphasis, but again, it doesn't smear up the mid-range. And frankly, like, I don't know, it's definitely not an overbearing sub-bass the way that I found the original Monarch. So very well balanced overall here. I like that. On the topic of that mid-range, so it's not just a mid-range focused tune, and I think the mid-range resolution is actually really pretty excellent. It's not aggressively textured, and I think a lot of that comes from the very polite lower treble. So I would say it's not an aggressively textured mid-range, but you do get still a really good sense of that micro contrast, which I find just brings out that sense of detail as you're listening to things like vocals, or even, you know, guitar strums and stuff like that. But really for me, it's like vocal texture comes across really quite well while not being, you know, sharp and aggressive and gritty in any way. Again, a lot of that comes from the treble tuning, which I think is really quite excellent here on the Monarch Mark II. Again, neither bright nor dark, and it's really, really well extended. Just overall quite smooth, and it kind of gives the mid-range. I think both the mid-range and the treble give this kind of like an Sennheiser HD 600 ease. Not that it's exactly the same tonally, or it's hard even to compare headphones and IEMs in a lot of ways, but there is just kind of like a sense of, it just does everything really well and really easily. Like there's no strain on anything. And that's a sense that I really get here with the Monarch Mark II. And then the other thing that's quite standout about this set is the stereo imaging. So, you know, I love the Moondrop Blessing too. Tonally, it's almost perfect for me. And honestly, like the imaging on the Blessing 2 is not bad, but that is one of the things as I'm listening to some of these higher end sets that starts to stand out, is there is just like kind of a next level in terms of imaging and head stage that you can get from some of these more expensive sets. And I think the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II delivers that. Just outstanding separation and layering, a nice wide image, and really quite distinct positioning of sound. So That's what I love here about the sound on the Monarch Mark II. But there are some things that I don't love. And one of them I would say is probably the bigger problem for me. And we'll talk about that specifically. One thing to start out with, though, is actually interesting. When I first started listening to this thing, especially once I got my own copy, I was actually having some issues with treble sharpness. I mentioned I was struggling with the fit. Once I arrived at these tips, that treble sharpness went away entirely. So thought it was worth calling out here. If you're listening to the Monarch Mark II and you get some of that treble sharpness, it might be something that you can solve with a tip change. And it's not because I think the Aslas happen to have perfect treble tuning or anything like that. Tips just, they help fit, and fit can definitely affect sound. So find something that fits you comfortably. These maybe moving the drivers, 2 millimeters further away, reduce some of that sharpness and overall just solve that problem for me. But worth calling out here in this section of talking about what I don't like, because frankly, there's not a lot that I don't like. But what I will say, the bigger issue for me here on the Monarch Mark II is it's kind of the bass tuning, actually, interestingly enough. So I complained about the bass on the original Monarch being too bassy, just like really kind of goofy amounts of sub bass. They really pulled that back here. It doesn't show up on a graph, which is interesting. It definitely, to my ear, sounds much less bassy than the original Monarch. But it's actually probably a little bit too less bassy, especially in the mid bass. It's just a little bit too lean for my taste, right? So like I mentioned, it's got that Harman scoop where the lower mid-range is, there's like kind of like this straight line from the lower mid-range into the sub bass. And again, I'm not in the business of reviewing frequency responses. And I've already talked about where sometimes the frequency response is not telling the story that I hear. But in this case, this lower mid-range Harman scoop is a thing that I hear. And I find that it leads this to being just a sound that's a little bit too lean, a little too dry. If you're listening to music that doesn't have a lot of sub bass content in it, it can come across actually as like not bassy at all. It can lack a sense of bass, and because of that lack of bass, it lacks that sense of depth, right? At least the way that I hear these things, right? When I'm talking about stereo imaging, there's like a width aspect to it, and a lot of that can come from, the separation in the sounds and like the treble tuning, and then there's like a depth aspect to it. And a lot of times, for me, the depth is really coming from the bass. And when this set doesn't have a lot of sub bass thrown at it, like if you're not listening to EDM, you're not listening to electronic music, if you're listening to like classic rock or something like that, the set can really just come across a little bit flat in sort of that front to back depthness. And I think related to that, it does lack a richness of sound. So while I gave that Sennheiser HD 600 comparison, talking about how easy it is at delivering, that mid-range and treble detail, it really does lack the body and the warmth of the HD 600, which is not like a bassy warm set. Like I'm using this word warmth to describe more the mid-range, less so the bass. And the Monarch Mark II is just, it lacks that. And I think kind of related to that, it ends up lacking a bit of that visceral hook. So those are my basic thoughts here on the Monarch Mark II. Definitely a lot to like, but how does it compare to some of my other favorite IMs? So let's move this stuff out of the way and pull in some others. Of course, we've got to compare it to the Moondrop Blessing 2. I've talked too much smack with this earphone. I got to bring it in for head to head. It's got to stand up. I'm also going to talk about the Moondrop S8, which frankly shares a lot in common with the Blessing 2. Maybe it's not fair that both of these are ganging up on the Monarch, but we're going to do it anyway. And I'm also going to bring in another IM that I bought for myself this year. This is the Campfire Audio Ara, which might be a bit of a surprise to see on this table, but this is a set that I've been enjoying a lot this year. So I thought it would be worth comparing. So just a quick overview of what we got here on the table. The ThieAudio Monarch Mark II, again, a tribrid IM, 2 ESTs, 6 BAs, 1 dynamic driver, $1,000. Here we've got the Campfire Audio Ara. This is an all balanced armature set. It's $1,300. And there are 7 BAs inside there. Don't worry, I bought it used. I didn't pay $1,300 for it. And then of course we've got the Moondrop S8, a classic favorite here on Super Review. This is an 8 BA set, comes in at $700. And then of course the Moondrop Blessing 2, which is a hybrid IM. This is 4 BAs, 1 dynamic driver, and by far the cheapest IM here on the table at just $320. So quite a range of earphones, and if it seems like this is out of place in the comparison, it's really just because this keeps being my favorite IM. And when I was ostensibly looking for a new favorite IM, well, we gotta bring in the old one so we can talk about how it compares. So those are the competitors. Let's talk about just the general tuning, the sound signature. Like I mentioned, the Monarch Mark II, a lean neutral. It's got that sub bass boost. It gives you a nice sense of transparency, but it's a little bit on the thin side. The Ara, in contrast, is, well, I'll say up front, these are all some form of neutral. The Ara is the most interesting, I think, or maybe the most peculiar in terms of its tuning. I would say this is kind of a bright neutral, but there's a bit of warmth in the vocal region, especially. If you look at this thing on a graph, it looks kind of weird. I gotta be honest, I think it sounds more natural than it graphs. But when you're listening to it head to head with this bunch, the vocal tuning on this seems a little bit more reserved versus, I would say, all three of these. But how it makes up for that kind of reserved vocals is actually in somewhat elevated treble, so it keeps kind of like this bright forward tune. The Moondrop S8, in contrast, I would say this is kind of a lean neutral with sub bass boost, very much in line with the Monarch Mark II, if I'm honest, but maybe with a little bit more lower energy treble, so it gives it just a little bit extra bite, a little bit of extra brightness, and a little bit of extra visceralness, and depending on what you're listening to. Well, we'll talk about the technical stuff on this, where the bass can be a little bit disappointing. But and then finally, the Moondrop Blessing 2. This is basically the basis of my neutral target. So for me, this is just neutral. It's maybe a tad on the bright side. If you're worried about something being even remotely bright, this is maybe a tad on the bright side, but really you just get a nice a richness of mid-range. It's full mid-range. And to be honest, I think better bass presence versus the Monarch Mark II. You get more of a linear rise from 1000 hertz up down to 20 hertz, where rather than getting that leanness in the Harman style scoop, this is just more linear and you get a little bit of meat on the bass, but definitely not a bassy set. In fact, I would say none of these sets really come across as bassy. If I were to rank these in terms of my personal tonal preferences, I'm going to have to say, no, don't get shocked, the Moondrop Blessing 2 is still my favorite. I would say the S8 and the Monarch Mark II are probably trading blows, and then the Ara would be in the back. I don't think it's, again, this is totally not as funky as it graphs, but in comparison to these two, I would still probably rank this one last. So that is my ranking for tonal. These are supposed to be even, but let's talk about how these now compare in terms of technical performance, right? It's kind of the fun stuff. So the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II, again, we just got done talking about this, but just really excellent treble extension, a wide stereo image, and a really great sense of micro contrast. The real demerit here in terms of technical performance, I think, is the bass performance. It's, when you get that bass, it's tight, it's punchy bass, it's good. But a lot of the times you don't get a lot of that bass because of that. Well, a lot of it's coming from the tuning, but that contributes to the overall technical performance because I think it lacks a bit of depth and just kind of comes across a little bit sterile because of that. The Ara, in contrast, is a very different IM. This is an all balanced armature set, so you might be surprised that the bass in this is actually really pretty good. Is it good for balanced armatures, or is it good bass? Well, I would say in this bunch, it's good bass. I don't know if it's fantastic bass. It's probably fantastic bass for BA and very good bass on this table. So we'll just say that. Apart from that, I would also say that the imaging here on the Ara is the most standout. I know there's a word that some people cringe at, but it feels like the right word to use here. The imaging on this set, I would say, is more holographic than the others. It just really gives you a strong sense of, especially vocal positioning, and then everything around it in 3D space is really quite standout and a lot of fun here on the Ara. I mentioned that the tonal balance is not my liking as much as these are, but that technical, that imaging performance is really just so standout that I keep coming back to this set a lot. Now, the treble can be a little bit sharp on this set. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as sibilant, but with sibilant tracks, it doesn't deal with it as smoothly as these three sets do. So a bit of a warning there. It's not quite as well executed there in the treble, but that imaging is really awesome. The bass is really satisfying. really surprisingly visceral set for an all balanced armature earphone. Okay, the Moondrop S8, excellent treble smoothness. In fact, I would say this is like, has been some of my favorite treble. I got this almost a couple years ago now at this point, but it's still like some of my favorite treble I've heard in an IM. You get, I think, also excellent mid-range detail and resolution, just like this sense of transparency. A lot of what I like about the Moondrop Blessing 2 also you get here in the S8 that way. But you also get it with that extended treble that just gives you, I think, better timbre on things like hi-hats, high frequency percussion, you know, drum brushes, all that kind of stuff. Just comes across, I think, more naturally because of this. Now, interestingly, in the bass region, this is an all balanced armature set. So again, we're gonna quibble a little bit about the bass. You don't get quite that same sub bass texture, that sub bass physicality that you get on these sets because they have dynamic drivers. But I do feel like the mid bass might actually be a little bit better here on the S8 than it is on the Monarch Mark II. I don't know, maybe I'm smoking, but that was definitely the impression that I got after extensive comparisons with these two IMs. So there you go. Maybe my only quibble here with this set is that it can be a little bit on the clinical side, very similar to the Monarch Mark II. But there you go. And then finally, the Moondrop Blessing 2. Surprisingly, look, 300 bucks, it's not a cheap IM, but on this table, it's by far the cheapest. And surprisingly, I think it actually kind of hangs in there in the technical performance. It definitely is not as impressive in like the treble airiness and stuff like that. So like if you're looking for that sense of space, and again, like that timbre on high frequency percussion is where the Blessing 2 starts to fall behind a little bit. But the mid-range resolution on the set is still standout, even listening to versus these sets. Okay, maybe it's not quite standout versus like something like the Ara, where you just really get this sense of resolving power, but it's really quite excellent. And then I think the bass on this set is actually underrated. You know, it's not a lot of bass. This is not a bassy earphone, but it hits really good. It's got a nice tightness to it. It's, you know, it's got a decent sense of definition on the attack. It's not the best bass, but in terms of like the tuning performance or the tuning, I love it. And I think that the actual listening experience is really quite satisfying. And I think that the bass performance on this set outperforms the bass on the S8 and even outperforms the bass here on the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II. So if I were to rank these things in terms of technical performance, this is a little bit trickier because they all kind of trade blows, but I'm gonna say the Ara is the one that's like the most impressive. And then I would say that the Monarch Mark II and the S8 kind of trade blows. They've got different benefits, and then the Blessing 2 will, you know, I'll be real. It is the least impressive technically, but like I mentioned, it still kind of hangs in there, which is for the price, I think a win. And then finally, we'll talk about the physical stuff, the form factor. The Mark II, I just got done talking about this thing. This thing is chonk AF. I think aesthetically it looks pretty nice. Again, I think this cable looks pretty nice, but it's too big. In the ears, this earphone is too big. I think it's not just a fair warning to people out there. Like, I think it's a serious, I want to say it's a problem. Given the fact of how many of these things I see for sale, and the stated reason that they're for sale is because they're so big, I feel like they need to figure out a way to make this thing smaller. So there you go. The Campfire Ara, in comparison, is a surprisingly good fit. Actually, let's punch in on this so you can take a look at this. These things are actually made out of all titanium, as far as I understand, and they are a little bit, you see, chiseled on the edges, which I would kind of assume as not a great choice for something that's going into the ear, but I gotta be honest, these things actually fit me excellently. They are a little bit on, I would say, medium small size, and then fit security is surprisingly good. I don't know if it has to do with the angle of the nozzle, the length of the nozzle just being kind of just right, and you might notice I've got spring tips on it because I'm a spring tip shill, but really, I don't know, I love both the aesthetic of the Ara, I love the fit of the Ara, I love the feel of the Ara. This is just a really excellently built set, kind of like an art piece. The Moondrop S8, I think, is also a bit of an art piece. One of my favorite builds in an IM. I think aesthetically, it is still quite beautiful. One of the more transparent resins out there. It is a solid resin, so it kind of has like this glass-like look. I love it, love it, love it. But maybe even more importantly, The fit on this set is just about perfect for my ears. This is a set that I can plug in, go to sleep, and wake up and it's still in my ears, hasn't shifted a bit. I'm really quite happy with the build there. And then the Moondrop Blessing 2 build quality, actually, I would say very good fit security. This one's a little bit larger than the Moondrop S8, especially down here. But in comparison to the largeness complaints I have about the Monarch, it's not even close. The Blessing 2 is a medium large earphone for sure, but I don't know. I'm done giving warnings about the Blessing 2. I think the fit on this thing is actually really good, just not quite as good as this. So if I were to rank these things in terms of form factor, physical stuff, honestly, like I would have a hard time picking between these two. The fit of this is perfect. The fit of this is almost as good, and the build quality on both of them is really quite standout. And then next, I would say the Moondrop Blessing 2. Really no quibbles with the build on the set, and in the bottom, unfortunately, it's going to be the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II. So I think that's going to do it for all my thoughts here on the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II. Again, I bought this because I was hoping to have finally found the Cuba Buck replacement for my Moondrop Blessing 2, and did I? To be honest, I don't think I did. I'm still going to be going back to my Moondrop Blessing 2 probably more often than I listen to this for two big reasons. One, it's too big. Two is just that over leanness in the lower mid-range where it just comes across a little bit clinical. Now, I'm being super picky. This is a fantastic sounding set, and I don't feel bad for having spent the money on it that I did, but has it replaced the Moondrop Blessing 2 for me? I don't think so. That said, I will still give this thing a very solid 4 stars out of 5. Just take it with the warning that it might not fit your ear, and that might be a very serious reason why you won't be able to live with this. As I accidentally club myself again with this chonky termination. But anyway, if you're interested in checking out the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II, I do have links in the description down below, and while you're down there. If you found this video helpful, or you're having fun, you're enjoying yourself on a Sunday afternoon, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and join my Discord server where you can now become a premium member and have access to my review notes before I do my reviews. In fact, if you were a premium member in the past couple of weeks, you would have already known what I was going to say about the ThieAudio Monarch Mark II because I wrote it down. I mean, I didn't write down the exact words I was going to write, but I wrote down most of this stuff. And if you're a premium member in Discord, you get to read that stuff early. But otherwise, thanks for watching. If you're here live, stick around, we'll have a chat. Otherwise, I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.